The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows of our modest two-story home in the quiet suburb of Maplewood Estates. Snow fell in relentless sheets, blanketing the cul-de-sac in a suffocating white haze. It was January, the kind of bitter Midwest winter night that made you question why anyone chose to live in Illinois. Inside, my son, Ethan, sat bundled in a thick quilt, his wheelchair positioned near the television, its glow casting shadows across his pale face. At 16, Ethan was no stranger to hardship. Born with a rare genetic disorder that weakened his muscles, he never walked, and cold weather brought him excruciating pain. As a single father and a retired Army Major General, I'd faced my share of battles, but nothing prepared me for the war I was about to wage in my neighborhood. My name is Robert Mitchell. For 20 years, I served my country, leading troops through chaos in deserts and jungles, coordinating relief in disaster zones, and staring down threats that would make most men flinch. When I retired, I thought the worst was behind me. Ethan and I moved to Maplewood Estates 6 months ago, seeking a fresh start after years of military postings. The neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and tidy brick homes, seemed like the perfect place to give Ethan stability. The Homeowners Association, HOA, promised order and community. I assumed their rules were meant to keep things pleasant, not to endanger lives. How wrong I was. That night, the storm was fiercer than predicted. The weather app on my phone warned of sub-zero wind chills, and the local news urged residents to stay indoors. Ethan had been fine earlier, watching reruns of old sitcoms, his laughter a rare gift that warmed the house. But around 8 p.m., I noticed his breathing change. It grew shallow, labored, like he was fighting for each inhale. His skin turned ashen, and his eyes fluttered, half-lidded, as if he were slipping away. My heart lurched. I knelt beside him, checking the portable oxygen monitor clipped to his finger. The reading was dangerously low, below 85%. Ethan's condition made him vulnerable to sudden drops in temperature, and the cold was strangling him. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice steady despite the panic clawing at my chest. "My son's in critical condition," I told the dispatcher. "He's disabled. Oxygen levels dropping fast. We need an ambulance now." She assured me help was on the way, estimating 10 minutes despite the storm. I threw on a jacket, stepped onto the porch, and peered into the swirling snow, searching for the flash of red lights. The cold bit at my face, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was Ethan, alone inside, fighting to breathe. Minutes later, I heard the faint wail of a siren. It grew louder, cutting through the wind, and my shoulders sagged with relief. But then the sound stopped abruptly, just around the corner of our street. Confusion turned to dread. Something was wrong. I yanked on my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the noise. The beam of my light caught the ambulance, its red and white lights pulsing against the blizzard. It sat idling at the intersection, unable to move. Blocking its path was a black SUV, parked diagonally across the narrow road like a barricade. A woman stood in front of it, arms crossed, her puffy coat and stylish boots absurdly out of place in the storm. Her face was a mask of indignation, as if the paramedics had insulted her personally. The ambulance driver leaned out his window, shouting over the wind, "Ma'am, we've got a medical emergency. A kid's in critical condition." I caught fragments of their argument as I approached, my boots crunching through the ice. The woman waved a piece of paper, a map or regulation, maybe, and yelled about HOA rules, claiming the ambulance couldn't proceed without authorization. My blood ran colder than the air around me. That kid was my son. "Hey," I called, my voice sharp with urgency. "That ambulance is for my son. He's dying in there." Up close, I saw her clearly, mid-50s, blonde hair tucked under a knit cap, lips pursed in a smug line. I didn't know her name, but I'd heard whispers from neighbors about the HOA president, a woman they called the dictator of Maplewood. This had to be her. Margaret Voss, they'd said, though everyone just called her Maggie. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing as if I were an inconvenience. "Do you know who I am?" she snapped, holding up her paper like a shield. This is a private road, and your ambulance is violating HOA guidelines. It'll ruin the freshly plowed cul-de-sac. Her voice dripped with condescension, each word slap. I stared, incredulous. My son was slipping away, and she was worried about tire marks. I forced myself to stay calm, years of military training kicking in. Ma'am, my son is disabled. He's losing consciousness. We don't have time for this. I gestured to the ambulance, where the paramedics looked frantic, one already on the radio. Maggie didn't budge. Rules are rules, Mr. Mitchell, I said through gritted teeth. Robert Mitchell. Well, Mr. Mitchell, you should have filed an emergency vehicle request. Large vehicles damage our roads, and the HOA has standards to uphold. She folded her arms tighter, as if that settled it. I glanced at the paramedics, who were trying to maneuver around her SUV, but the street was flanked by towering snowbanks. One wrong move, and they'd be stuck in a drift. The driver shook his head, muttering about calling the police. I wanted to scream, to shove her car out of the way myself, but I knew that would only escalate things. Instead, I turned to the paramedics. Follow me on foot. Bring what you can carry. We'll get to my son. They nodded, grabbing their kits and stumbling through the snow behind me. Maggie shouted after us, something about fines and citations, but I tuned her out. My only focus was on Ethan. The 100-yard trek back to the house felt like a marathon. My boots sank into drifts, the wind stinging my eyes. The paramedics struggled with their gear, but we pushed on. Inside, Ethan was barely conscious, his lips tinged blue. The paramedics dropped to their knees, checking his vitals. His pulse was weak, his oxygen levels critical. They started in 4-drip, but their faces told me the truth. They needed the ambulance's advanced equipment. Oxygen tanks, warming blankets, monitors. All of it was stuck down the street, blocked by Maggie's SUV. One paramedic, a young guy with a tight jaw, looked at me. We're doing what we can, but he's not stable. We need that ambulance. My stomach twisted. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called the dispatcher again, begging for a second unit or a snowplow. She said they were trying, but the storm had overwhelmed the city. My eyes darted to Ethan, his chest rising and falling too slowly. I'd seen death before, on battlefields, in hospitals, but nothing compared to watching my son fade. Then my phone buzzed. A neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, was on the line. Robert, the police are here, but that woman's still arguing. She's quoting HOA bylaws like they're the Constitution. I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to storm back out there. Ethan needed me here. The paramedics suggested carrying him to the ambulance, but the wind chill, 20 below zero, could kill him in his fragile state. We were trapped, caught in a nightmare where bureaucracy trumped humanity. I stepped to the window, peering through the frost. The ambulance's lights still flashed, a cruel reminder of help just out of reach. Maggie stood there, unmoved, her SUV a silent sentinel. Something in me hardened. I'd faced insurgents, navigated minefields, and rebuilt villages after earthquakes. I wasn't about to let a petty HOA tyrant decide my son's fate. But for now, I had to wait, pray, and trust the police to break through. Every second felt like a lifetime, and Ethan's life hung in the balance. The living room felt like a battlefield, the air thick with tension as the paramedics worked over Ethan. His frail body lay still under the quilt, the 4-drip snaking from his arm to a bag held aloft by one of the medics. The soft beep of the portable monitor punctuated the silence, each sound a reminder that my son was still with me, for now. Outside, the blizzard raged on, the wind screaming through Maplewood Estates like a warning. I stood by the window, my breath fogging the glass, watching the distant red glow of the ambulance lights. They hadn't moved. Maggie Voss, the HOA president, still held her ground, her SUV blocking the only path to Ethan's survival. I gripped my phone, the dispatcher's voice crackling through the storm's interference. We got another unit en route, Mr. Mitchell, but the roads are a mess. The police are on scene. They're trying to resolve it. Trying. The word felt like a punch. My son didn't need trying. He needed help now. I thanked her and hung up, turning back to the paramedics. The younger one, his name tag reading Dan, met my eyes. He's stable for the moment, but we need the ambulance's equipment. His core temperature's dropping. I nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to choke me. A knock at the door startled me. 2 police officers stood on the porch, snow-caked on their jackets. I recognized them from a neighborhood barbecue last fall. Officer Reynolds, a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor, and Officer Patel, younger, with a calm but firm presence. They stepped inside, shaking off the cold. "Mr. Mitchell," Reynolds said, "we've got a situation. The HOA president, MS. Voss won't move her vehicle. Says the ambulance is violating private property rules." I stared, incredulous. My son's dying, and she's worried about property? My voice cracked, betraying the anger I'd kept in check. Patel raised a hand, his tone measured. "We've explained it's an emergency, but she's quoting bylaws, claiming the HOA controls the roads during storms. We threatened to tow her SUV, but she says we need board approval." He hesitated, glancing at his partner. "We're working on it, but the storm's slowing everything down." I ran a hand through my hair, the weight of the situation crushing me. Ethan's monitor beeped again, weaker this time. Dan looked up. "We can't wait much longer." Something snapped inside me. I'd spent years commanding troops under fire, making split-second decisions that saved lives. I wasn't about to let a self-appointed suburban dictator outmaneuver me. "Officers," I said, my voice low, "come with me." We trudged back through the snow, the flashlight beam cutting through the blizzard. The scene at the intersection was surreal. The ambulance idling, its driver slumped in frustration, Maggie standing defiant, her arms crossed, and a small crowd of neighbors, bundled in coats, watching from their porches. The wind carried Maggie's voice as she lectured the ambulance driver. "This is about property values. You can't just tear up our roads without permission." The driver, a burly man named Tom, shouted back, "Lady, a kid is dying. Move your car." I stepped forward, my military bearing kicking in. "MS. Voss," I said, loud enough to cut through the wind, "you're endangering my son's life. Move your vehicle. Now." She turned, her eyes glinting with contempt. "Mr. Mitchell, I've already explained the rules. If you'd followed protocol, we wouldn't be here." Her tone was patronizing, like she was scolding a child. The neighbors murmured, their faces a mix of shock and fear. Maggie's reputation as the HOA's iron fist was well known, and few dared cross her. I took a step closer, my voice steady but edged with steel. "My son is disabled. He's losing consciousness because you're blocking his ambulance. This isn't about rules, it's about a life." She waved her paper, a crumpled HOA parking map, and scoffed. "The HOA has standards, Mr. Mitchell. Emergency vehicles need clearance. You should have planned." I glanced at the paramedics, then the officers, their faces tight with frustration. The absurdity of it, her obsession with pavement over a child's survival, ignited a fire in me. I lowered my voice, letting the weight of my words carry. "MS. Voss, I'm a retired Major General in the U.S. Army. I've seen what happens when people obstruct critical operations. You're committing a crime by blocking emergency services, and I'll make sure you face the consequences." For the first time, Maggie faltered, her smirk fading. Then she laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Your rank means nothing here. The HOA has authority over these roads." The crowd gasped, and even Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow. I turned to Reynolds, my tone clipped. "Officer, interfering with a general's directive during an emergency can escalate to federal jurisdiction. Give her one last warning." Reynolds nodded, stepping forward. "MS. Voss, move your vehicle, or we'll tow it. This is your final chance." Maggie clutched her papers, her face reddening. "You can't do that without board approval. These roads are private, paid for by our dues." She ranted about tire marks, snowplow costs, and property lines, as if Ethan's life were a minor inconvenience. The standoff stretched on, each minute a dagger in my chest. I thought of Ethan, alone in the house, his breath shallow, his body cold. The neighbors watched, some whispering, others filming with their phones. The debate was already brewing. Rules versus humanity, authority versus compassion. I could feel the tension, the kind that sparks arguments over dinner tables and divides communities. Maggie's arrogance was a lightning rod, and I knew this moment would ripple far beyond tonight. Then, new sirens pierced the night. A city police truck, equipped with snow chains, rumbled onto the street, pushing through the drifts. A lieutenant hopped out, his face grim. He marched straight to Maggie. "Ms. Voss, I'm Lieutenant Carter. Move your vehicle now, or it's getting towed." Maggie repeated her mantra about bylaws, but Carter cut her off. "You're obstructing emergency services. That's a crime. Step aside." He radioed for a tow truck, his voice sharp. Maggie's eyes widened, her composure cracking. She unleashed a tirade, calling the officers incompetent, claiming she'd single-handedly kept Maplewood Estates pristine. The neighbors watched, some nodding in silent agreement, others shaking their heads. The divide was clear, those cowed by Maggie's reign versus those fed up with her tyranny. Finally, with a huff, she stomped to her SUV and moved it, tires crunching against the snow. The ambulance lurched forward, battling the wind. I sprinted back to the house, my heart pounding. Inside, the paramedics had kept Ethan stable, but his condition was deteriorating. The relief was palpable as the ambulance crew wheeled in their equipment. Oxygen tanks, warming blankets, a cardiac monitor. They hooked Ethan up, administering warmed fluids. His lips, still tinged blue, began to regain color. "Dan," the paramedic clapped my shoulder. "He's fighting, Mr. Mitchell. We'll get him to the hospital." The next challenge was transporting Ethan through the storm. The paramedics prepared a specialized stretcher to shield him from a cold. Officer Patel and I shoveled a path to the ambulance, our breaths clouding in the frigid air. Maggie stood nearby, glaring but silent, her arms crossed. As we carefully carried Ethan out, I overheard her muttering about the eyesore of emergency vehicles. The remark shattered my restraint. I wheeled on her, my voice low and lethal. "You've made the biggest mistake of your life, Ms. Voss. If my son dies because of you, I'll make sure you never hurt another family again." She snorted, unfazed. "The HOA has lawyers, Mr. Mitchell. Your threats are meaningless." I didn't respond. My focus was on Ethan, now secured in the ambulance. I followed in my truck, its snow chains grinding against the ice. The hospital was 10 miles away, a treacherous drive in the storm. As we crawled along, I replayed the night's events, my anger simmering. Maggie's actions weren't just petty. They were dangerous, a stark reminder of how power, unchecked, could harm the vulnerable. The debate over her behavior would rage on, but for now, I had one mission: keeping Ethan alive. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the pediatric ICU. Ethan lay in a warming bed, tubes and wires snaking from his small frame to machines that beeped in a steady rhythm. His chest rose and fell, each breath a small victory. The doctors had diagnosed early hypothermia, triggered by his condition and the brutal cold of the blizzard. They'd stabilized him, but he'd need to stay for observation, his fragile body monitored around the clock. I sat by his bedside, my hands clasped, the weight of the night pressing down on me. The image of Maggie Voss's SUV blocking the ambulance burned in my mind, her smug indifference a stark contrast to the fear in Ethan's eyes. It was past midnight, and the hospital was quiet, save for the soft hum of equipment and the occasional murmur of nurses. I replayed the events in my head. The storm, Ethan's shallow breathing, the ambulance's flashing lights stalled at the corner. Maggie's voice, sharp and unyielding, echoed in my memory. "Rules are rules, Mr. Mitchell." I'd seen cruelty in war zones, men who valued power over lives, but never in a suburban neighborhood where manicured lawns hit a different kind of battlefield. My anger wasn't just for Ethan. It was for every family Maggie had bullied, every neighbor silenced by her reign. I pulled out my phone, The screens glow harsh in the dim room. I needed to act to ensure this wouldn't happen again. My first call was to an old friend, Tom Hargrove, a lawyer specializing in the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA). We'd met during my military days, when he'd helped navigate legal issues for wounded veterans. "Robert," he said, his voice groggy but sharp. "What's going on?" I recounted the night, the ambulance, Maggie's blockade, Ethan's brush with death. Tom's silence spoke volumes. "This is serious," he said finally. "Blocking emergency services is illegal, and if she targeted Ethan because of his disability, that's an ADA violation." "I'm in." My second call was to Mike Delgado, a former Army colleague, now working in local government. Mike had connections in the county sheriff's office and the mayor's administration. "Mitchell, you okay?" he asked. I told him about Maggie, the HOA, and the neighbors' whispers of her past abuses. Mike didn't hesitate. "I'll make some calls. We'll dig into the HOA's records. If she's got a pattern, we'll find it." I thanked him, a plan forming. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about justice for Maplewood Estates. The hospital stay stretched into 2 days. Ethan's color returned, and by the second morning, he managed a weak smile, asking for his favorite comic book. I read to him, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. But his eyes held a shadow, a flicker of fear from that night. "Dad," he said softly, "why wouldn't she let the ambulance come?" I struggled for an answer, settling on, "Some people care more about rules than people, son. But we're going to fix this." He nodded, trusting me, and that trust fueled my resolve. When Ethan was cleared to go home, I drove slowly, my truck's chains grinding against the thawing roads. Maplewood Estates looked different now, the snow drifts masking the tension beneath. Word of the incident had spread, and neighbors greeted me with cautious nods, their eyes darting as if Maggie might appear. Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who'd called during the standoff, stopped by with a casserole. "Robert, we're so glad Ethan's okay," she said, her voice low. "But Maggie's been terrorizing us for years. Last month, she threatened to fine the Wilsons because their daughter's wheelchair ramp was too wide." Her words hit like a grenade. The Wilsons' daughter, Lily, was 10, also wheelchair-bound. I remembered seeing her ramp, painted a soft blue, a beacon of accessibility in a neighborhood obsessed with uniformity. "Too wide?" I asked, my jaw tight. Mrs. Callahan nodded. Maggie said it ruined the aesthetic. She wanted it repainted beige or removed. The Wilsons caved, afraid of legal fees. I thanked her, my mind racing. Maggie's actions weren't just negligence. They were systematic, targeting the vulnerable. Back home, I set up a makeshift war room in my study. I spread out notes, jotting down Mrs. Callahan's story and others I'd heard. The elderly couple fined for a non-compliant mailbox. The single mom threatened with eviction over a backyard swing set. Maggie's HOA was a fiefdom, her rules enforced with fines and fear. I contacted more neighbors, asking for documents, violation notices, emails, anything showing her pattern. Most were hesitant, scarred by years of intimidation, but a few sent photos and letters, their courage sparking hope. One email stood out from a man named Carl Jenkins. He described how Maggie had delayed his father's medical transport last year, demanding a permit during a heart scare. "We waited 3 hours," Carl wrote. "Dad survived, but he's never been the same." I printed the email, adding it to my growing file. The debate over Maggie's actions was already simmering. Some neighbors defended her, citing her dedication to property values, while others saw her as a bully hiding behind bylaws. It was the kind of conflict that could split a community, and I knew exposing her would ignite a firestorm. I reached out to Channel 7 News, the local station known for investigative pieces. A reporter, Sarah Nguyen, answered my call. "Mr. Mitchell, this sounds like a story," she said after I summarized the incident. "A disabled kid nearly dying because of an HOA? That's a headline." We arranged an interview for the next morning in front of my driveway. Sarah arrived with a cameraman, her microphone poised. I recounted the ordeal, from Ethan's collapse to Maggie's blockade, careful to highlight the danger of denying emergency access. Tom, my lawyer friend, joined us, explaining potential ADA violations and the legal weight of obstructing paramedics. The segment aired that evening, and Maplewood Estates exploded. Social media buzzed with hashtags like hashtag #StopMaggieVoss and hashtag HOA tyranny. Viewers posted comments, some outraged. How could anyone block an ambulance? Others skeptical, defending HOA rules as necessary for order. The debate was electric, the kind that keeps people glued to their screens, arguing over coffee or in online forums. I watched the comments roll in, my resolve hardening. Maggie had underestimated the power of a community pushed too far. She tried to spin the story, citing the HOA's website. The storm was severe, and I was protecting our roads, she wrote. This has been blown out of proportion, but the public wasn't buying it. The police, spurred by the news, deepened their investigation, focusing on Maggie's physical interference with the ambulance. Tom began drafting a lawsuit, citing ADA violations and state laws protecting emergency access. Neighbors started coming forward, their stories a cascade of grievances. Maggie's fines for unsightly gardens, her threats against families with special needs kids, her obsession with control. By the weekend, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. The community center was packed, chairs spilling into the aisles. I wheeled Ethan in, his blanket tucked around him, his presence a quiet rebuke to Maggie's actions. The room buzzed with whispers, neighbors glancing at Maggie, who sat at the head table, flanked by nervous board members. She opened the meeting with a lecture on decorum, but the crowd's murmurs drowned her out. When she claimed the incident was misunderstood, the room erupted, voices demanding accountability. I stood, my military training guiding me to keep my statement clear and sharp. My son almost died because MS. Voss blocked his ambulance, I said, my voice carrying. He was freezing, barely conscious, while she argued about pavement. This isn't about rules, it's about humanity. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I described Ethan's condition, the paramedics' desperation, and Maggie's refusal to move. I paused, letting the weight settle. I'm a retired major general. I've seen obstruction in war zones, but never like this, in a neighborhood meant to be a home. The room fell silent, then exploded again as Mrs. Callahan took the microphone. Maggie fined my niece for her wheelchair ramp, she said, her voice trembling. It was blue, not beige. She called it an eyesore. Carl Jenkins spoke next, recounting his father's delayed transport. Story after story painted a picture of Maggie's reign, a petty tyrant who'd weaponized rules to intimidate. The debate over her leadership was no longer whispers. It was a roar, splitting the community between those who feared change and those who demanded it. The community center in Maplewood Estates was a powder keg, the air thick with anger and anticipation. Over 100 neighbors packed the hall, their faces a mix of resolve and fear, many attending an HOA meeting for the first time. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows on the linoleum floor. Maggie Voss sat at the head table, her posture rigid, flanked by board members who shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs. My son, Ethan, sat beside me in his wheelchair, bundled in a sweater, his presence a silent testament to the stakes of this fight. I'd faced hostile crowds in military briefings, but this was different. This was personal, and the outcome would shape our neighborhood's future. Maggie tried to control the room, banging a gavel and calling for order. Let's maintain decorum, she said, her voice shrill. The media has exaggerated this incident. I was protecting our community's standards during a severe storm. The crowd erupted in boos and shouts, her words like gasoline on a fire. Neighbors who'd once cowered under her threats now found their voices, emboldened by the news segment and the growing online outrage. The debate over her actions, rules versus lives, authority versus empathy, was no longer confined to whispers. It was a public reckoning. I stood, my heart steady from years of delivering high-stakes reports. MS. Voss. I began, my voice cutting through the noise, My son nearly died because you blocked his ambulance. He was freezing, barely breathing, while you stood in the snow, arguing about tire marks. I paused, letting the image sink in. I'm a retired major general. I've seen obstruction in war zones, but never in a neighborhood where families trust each other. You put rules above a child's life. Gasps rippled through the room, and Ethan squeezed my hand, his eyes fixed on the crowd. Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who'd brought us a casserole, took the microphone next. Maggie fined my niece for her wheelchair ramp because it wasn't the right shade of beige, she said, her voice shaking with anger. She called an eyesore, as if a child's safety doesn't matter. Carl Jenkins followed, his story about his father's delayed medical transport drawing murmurs of shock. One by one, neighbors shared their grievances. Fines for trivial infractions, threats of eviction over lawn ornaments, harassment of elderly residents unable to mow their grass to Maggie's exact standards. Each testimony peeled back another layer of her tyranny, revealing a pattern of abuse that had festered for years. Maggie's face reddened, her hands clutching a stack of HOA bylaws. These rules protect property values, she snapped. You're all ungrateful for the work I've done. The crowd roared, some shouting for her resignation, others demanding the HOA be dissolved. The board members exchanged nervous glances, clearly unprepared for the uprising. The vice president, a quiet man named Ed Larson, stood and raised his hands for silence. We've heard enough, he said, his voice trembling. Effective immediately, MS. Voss is removed as president, pending a full investigation. The room exploded in cheers, relief mingling with lingering fury. Maggie shot to her feet, paper scattering. This is outrageous, she shrieked. I've given everything to this community, and you're humiliating me. She stormed out, pushing past neighbors who refused to meet her gaze. The victory was bittersweet. Justice was coming, but the scars she'd left ran deep. I looked at Ethan, his eyes wide but hopeful, and knew this was only the beginning. The police investigation, fueled by the news coverage, moved quickly. They confirmed Maggie had physically obstructed the ambulance, a clear violation of state law. My lawyer friend, Tom Hargrove, filed a lawsuit citing ADA violations and interference with emergency services. He uncovered more. Maggie had raised HOA fees without proper votes, redirected funds to her own property's landscaping, and installed cameras facing neighbors' backyards, claiming it was for security. The financial auditor hired by the new board found thousands missing from HOA accounts, linked to Maggie's expenses, spa trips, designer furniture, even a new car. Neighbors kept coming forward, their stories a flood of outrage. A disability rights group contacted me, offering legal support and praising our courage. They joined Tom's lawsuit, expanding it to address every family Maggie had wronged. The online debate grew fiercer, with some defending Maggie's tough leadership as necessary for a nice neighborhood, while others called her a bully who'd exploited her power. Comments on the Channel 7 segment ranged from heartfelt support, prayers for Ethan, to heated arguments about HOA overreach. The story was a lightning rod, keeping viewers engaged and sharing their tales of injustice. Weeks later, I sat in the county courtroom, Ethan beside me in his wheelchair. The arraignment was packed, neighbors filling the benches, their faces a mix of anticipation and anger. Maggie stood before the judge, her tailored suit a stark contrast to her defeated posture. The charges were read: obstruction of emergency services, violation of disability rights statutes, and embezzlement. Her lawyer argued for a plea deal, claiming she didn't understand the severity, but the prosecution was relentless. Dashcam footage from the ambulance showed Maggie standing defiantly in the snow, her arms crossed as the paramedics pleaded. Eyewitness accounts, including mine and the officers, sealed her fate. Maggie pleaded guilty to multiple counts, agreeing to a hefty fine, restitution to affected families, and a public apology. The judge's voice was stern as he ordered her to read the apology in court. She stood, her eyes fixed on the floor, and delivered a stiff, insincere statement. I regret any distress caused by my actions. She never looked at Ethan or me, her pride unbroken even in defeat. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hollow. For me, the real victory was seeing her stripped of power. Her reign over Maplewood Estates ended. The HOA transformed. The new board, led by Ed Larson, rewrote the bylaws, scrapping rules that targeted the vulnerable. They formed volunteer committees to check on elderly and disabled residents during storms, ensuring no one faced Maggie's wrath again. A new policy was etched into the charter. No vehicle shall ever block emergency services, regardless of HOA guidelines. It was a permanent reminder of that frigid night, a safeguard for the future Hurley's future. Maplewood Estates began to heal. Neighbors built accessible ramps for families like the Wilsons, painted in bright colors as a quiet rebellion against Maggie's beige dictatorship. Kids played freely, no longer afraid of stepping on the wrong patch of grass. Mrs. Callahan organized a snow-shoveling roster for Ethan's wheelchair path, and families dropped off soup and cookies when he felt under the weather. The community center hosted potlucks, where stories of Maggie's reign were shared with laughter and disbelief. The debate over her actions lingered, a reminder of how close we'd come to tragedy, and how unity had prevailed. Maggie sold her house, unable to face the legal bills and the collapse of her reputation. Rumor had it she moved to Indiana, starting over in a new town. I felt a fleeting pang of pity, but it vanished when I remembered Ethan's pale face, the ambulance's lights flashing uselessly in the snow. She'd made her choice, and we'd made ours. Spring arrived in Maplewood Estates like a promise kept, the snow drifts giving way to blooming tulips and green lawns. The neighborhood, once stifled by Maggie Voss's iron grip, buzzed with a new energy. Kids raced bikes down the cul-de-sac, their laughter echoing where fear once reigned. Neighbors waved from porches, no longer glancing over their shoulders for the HOA's watchful eye. My son, Ethan, rolled along the sidewalk in his wheelchair, chasing a soccer ball with friends, his smile brighter than the April sun. I watched from our front yard, my heart full, but the memory of that January blizzard lingered, a scar that fueled our transformation. The aftermath of Maggie's downfall was seismic. The reformed HOA, now led by Ed Larson and a board of compassionate neighbors, became a model of fairness. They organized community events, from book clubs to storm preparedness workshops, fostering a sense of unity that had been absent for years. The volunteer committee for elderly and disabled residents grew, ensuring Ethan's wheelchair path stayed clear and families like the Wilsons had support. The new charter's bolded rule, "No vehicle shall ever block emergency services," was more than policy. It was a vow, etched in the community's conscience after Ethan's near tragedy. I was invited to speak at the HOA's first annual meeting under the new leadership. The community center was packed, the air warm with hope. Ethan sat beside me, his eyes scanning the crowd, a quiet pride in his posture. I stood at the podium, my military training keeping my voice steady. A year ago, this neighborhood was divided. I began. Fear kept us silent, while one person's obsession with rules nearly cost my son his life. But we stood together, and that unity is our strength. I paused, meeting neighbors' eyes. Real community isn't about perfect lawns. It's about protecting each other, especially the most vulnerable. The crowd applauded, some wiping tears. Mrs. Callahan, now a board member, shared how the HOA had funded new wheelchair ramps, painted in vibrant colors to honor Lily Wilson and Ethan. Carl Jenkins spoke of his father, now recovering with regular check-ins from volunteers. The meeting ended with a standing ovation for Ethan, who blushed but waved, his resilience a beacon for us all. The debate over Maggie's reign, rules versus humanity, had settled, but it left a legacy, a community determined to prioritize compassion. The legal fallout was equally decisive. Maggie's guilty plea led to fines totaling tens of thousands, restitution to families she'd harmed, and a permanent ban from HOA leadership roles. The financial audit exposed her embezzlement, over $50,000 siphoned for personal luxuries. Her former allies, including 2 board members, resigned in disgrace, unwilling to face scrutiny. The disability rights group that joined our lawsuit secured settlements for affected families, including the Wilsons, whose ramp was now a neighborhood landmark. Maggie's public apology, though forced, marked the end of her influence. She sold her home and left Illinois, her reputation in tatters. The story didn't stay local. National news outlets picked it up, with headlines like "Retired General Exposes HOA Tyranny" and "Blizzard Blockade Sparks Reform." Commentators debated HOA overreach, some defending strict rules as necessary for property values, others arguing for common sense over bureaucracy. Online forums buzzed with stories of similar abuses, keeping viewers engaged and sharing their own experiences. The narrative David versus Goliath, a father's fight for his son, resonated, driving clicks and shares. Channel 7's follow-up segment, filmed at our neighborhood barbecue, showcased Maplewood's rebirth, with Ethan's smile stealing the show. That barbecue was a turning point. The park behind the community center overflowed with families, the air thick with the scent of grilled burgers and blooming lilacs. Kids played tag, weaving around new accessibility ramps. The paramedics who'd saved Ethan, Dan, and Tom stopped by, joking about the insane blockade, but marveling at the neighborhood's change. Sarah Nguyen, the Channel 7 reporter, returned with a camera crew, capturing neighbors sharing potluck dishes and stories. She interviewed me under an oak tree, asking how it felt to see such a turnaround. "It's not about one person," I said, glancing at Ethan. "It's about a community choosing justice over fear. That's the real victory." Sarah turned to Ethan, who waved shyly. "I'm just glad we're all friends now," he said, his voice soft but clear. The segment aired days later, titled "From Tyranny to Togetherness," and went viral, amassing millions of views. Comments poured in, from heartfelt support, "Ethan's a hero," to heated debates about power and accountability. The story's emotional pull and moral clarity made it a YouTube algorithm darling, recommended alongside tales of triumph and redemption. The City Council recognized our efforts with a plaque, now hung in our living room beside Ethan's comic book collection. It read, "To Robert Mitchell for championing emergency accessibility and community unity." I didn't care about the recognition. The plaque was a reminder of how fragile life is, how one night could have ended differently. Ethan's health improved, though his condition still required vigilance. Winter months were tough, but our neighbors' snow-shoveling roster and regular check-ins eased the burden. Mrs. Callahan's chicken noodle soup became a weekly ritual, a small gesture that meant the world. Reflecting on that blizzard, I still feel a chill, not from the cold, but from how close we came to losing Ethan. Maggie's arrogance, her refusal to see beyond her precious rules, could have been fatal. Yet her downfall proved a truth I'd learned in the Army. No tyrant, no matter how powerful, can withstand a united front. Maplewood Estates became a case study in resilience, cited in articles and community workshops. The debate it sparked, about bullying, power, and the vulnerable, continued online, with viewers sharing stories of their battles against injustice. Ethan, now 17, found his lesson in the ordeal. One evening, as we sat on the porch, he said, "Dad, that night taught me something. Some people act mean, but if good people stand up, we can stop them." His words, simple yet profound, echoed why I'd served, to protect, to uphold justice. They also reminded me why we fought Maggie, not just for Ethan, but for every family who'd felt her wrath. Our neighborhood barbecue became an annual tradition, a celebration of unity. Last week, as I grilled hot dogs and watched Ethan race his wheelchair with Lily Wilson, I felt a peace I hadn't known since my military days. The paramedics returned, now friends, and we laughed about the storm, though the memory still stung. Maplewood Estates was no longer a place of silent stares. It was a home, forged in adversity, strengthened by courage. As I stand on my porch tonight, sometimes hearing a distant ambulance siren, I'm reminded of that fateful night. But I also see the ramps, the smiles, the neighbors who become family. Maggie Voss messed with the wrong father, the wrong community. Her legacy is a lesson. Decency triumphs over cruelty, unity over intimidation. Ethan's smile, as he rolls along his cleared path, is the greatest victory, a testament to what we can achieve when we stand together. I hope our story inspires you. Have you faced a bully like Maggie, someone who puts rules above people? How did you respond? Share your thoughts in the comments below, especially on bullying and injustice in our lives. Take a stand. Tell us your perspective, your stories. Your voice matters, just as ours did in Maplewood. Let's keep this conversation alive, because kindness and courage can change everything.